A lot being written right now about Gorbachev, especially in light of his legacy. What do you see his legacy as being?
He recognized the Soviet Union, as Russia was called then, the empire, was in dire straits, and he knew drastic action had to be taken. It meant opening up politically and economically. And I think in the back of his mind, he had the hope, although he never expressed it in a straightforward way, he had the hope that Russia could take up where it was before World War I. Before World War I, Russia had the highest growth rates, economic growth rates in Europe. It was rapidly industrializing. It was the biggest grain exporter in the world. It was lurching in a halting way to something resembling a constitutional monarchy. Courts were beginning to get real freedom. Russia had ugly side then, most notably anti-Semitism, but liberalization forces were moving and Russia was modernizing. World War I destroyed that, brought in a communist regime that I think destroyed the soul of the Russian nation, brought out the worst in people, mass murders. They say, well, Russia industrialized. Well, Russia was industrializing anyway. So I think Gorbachev wanted to go, in effect, to pre-1914 and get Russia on a path that would become a gradually more open and dynamic and free economy.
It's interesting since we are going back to the time of the Tsar. Was he really an iconoclast at that time in the 1980s, or was he very much echoing the broad sentiment of the people? I mean, we certainly, we do a lot of looking back on Russia, the Soviet Union, from our perspective of today, but it's hard to know what the zeitgeist was like in the 80s. I'm curious to what extent was he really echoing the broad sentiment of the party in talking about glasnost and perestroika?
I think he knew the party well enough to know the party was entrenched, it was sclerotic, it couldn't make changes, and therefore I think he wanted to go around the party to force the kind of changes to get the country back on track. And unfortunately, forces got in the way. A coup happened in 1991. And even though the party fell, the Soviet Union split into 15 different republics, the kind of reforms he wanted, he just didn't have the power to get them done. And also, he wasn't sure of how to do it. How do you break up a 70-year-old regime that is all powerful and start to allow, without having it turn into chaos, more freedom, more economic opportunity? Easy to say, quite tough to do. And I'll be blunt, a lot of the policies the West adopted, including the US in the 1990s after Gorbachev had left office, hurt the Russian economy, advocating devaluations, which set off a hyperinflation, raising taxes. Russia had made our IRS code look pristine and simple in comparison. And so the 90s were a time of poverty, and that poverty time, which we were making worse by our advice, made possible the rise of Putin and going backwards instead of forward on economic and political liberalization.